Hello, the San Antonio Express News,
One
diversity.
second, Gilbert. 1 second. All right. All right, go ahead.
Hello, the San Antonio Express News Diversity and Inclusion Committee welcomes everyone to History and Headlines, a reckoning of the Express News coverage of race from the 1960s to the present day. We appreciate you joining us for this special event. My name is Gilbert Garcia. I'm a Metro columnist at the San Antonio Express News, and I'll be moderating this conversation. You probably noticed you can't see me. We've had some technical issues, but the important thing is you can see all the speakers, and that's what's really important. And I'm going to introduce them now. Our speakers are Madeline Mendoza, culture editor for MySA, Misty Harris, op-ed and letters editor, and Carrie Clack, columnist and member of the editorial board. This event is all about acknowledging and examining this newspaper's past failures in its coverage of race so that we can all learn from those mistakes and dedicate ourselves to doing better. To set the tone for this conversation, Misty Harris would like to review some examples of headlines the newspaper has published on issues affecting race.
Hi, everyone. Welcome and thanks for joining us today. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to share my screen with you so you can see some examples that I pulled out for you. So I'm going to go ahead and share it now. And you should be able to see my screen here. Hold on. Okay, so I'm going to go through these examples kind of quickly, but we'll probably have some more time to talk about them during the panel discussion. And feel free to submit questions if you have questions about any of the examples I've shared, as we'll have some Q&A at the end of this talk. So talking with some of my colleagues and also some former Express news writers and editors and just members of the community, I've come across, and my own research, because I used to be the news researcher and archivist at the San Antonio Express News, which I did that for 5.5 years. I've come across certain things in the San Antonio Express News that just kind of gave me pause and made me like kind of reflect, like why did we make the decisions we made? So some of these examples include headlines, photos, language we used, and what or who gets included or excluded from our coverage. And lastly, who is invited to the conversation? Who is making these decisions? Who is making these choices about what our paper is going to look like? So this first example I have here, I am comparing headlines because you'll see that these headlines have very different impacts on people emotionally, but they're all describing the same event. The first one here is the San Antonio Express News. And this is after MLK got assassinated. Their headline reads, "Negro Leader Assassinated." The next one is the San Antonio Light, where theirs reads, "LBJ calls for National Day of Mourning Day for King." And the last one is a San Francisco Chronicle article, and at the very top of the front page it says "Dr. King murdered," and it's all in black. And I just feel like these are choices that were made and they impact how we view events. This next one is a showcasing how a photo can impact a reader. This one is a front page from the San Antonio Express and News. And it was on August 14th, 1965. And it shows a little boy and he's got his hand to his head and he's sitting on the top of a car. What really struck me about this photo is this photo was next to a story that's about the riots that were happening in a Black section of Los Angeles, and it shows a little white boy. And this was a framed copy of this front page used to hang across from the staff elevators in the recently closed San Antonio Express News building. And I would always look at this photo and it would just always bother me that it didn't seem that the photo accurately described the story. And then these next few examples I'm going to give are going to show how language evolves, and also how even offensive and derogatory terms that newspapers use can evolve, but sometimes they're a little bit slow to evolve. For instance, this is a San Antonio Express news story, and the headline reads, "Wetback Law Would Create Millions of Jobs." So we all know that that's a very offensive term, but at the time it didn't seem offensive to people because there was actually, and I had to research this, there was actually a government operation in the 1970s called Operation Wetback. And it's where the government would deport people from Mexico and South America. And that was the official title of it. So it was a little offensive. And even then there was pushback from people to not use that term. And you'll see this later on in the 70s, and they've switched the word alien, but still this is a pretty offensive headline. New breed of alien turns to crime. And this is 1976. And if you'll go to the next slide, it shows that in almost 20 years later in 1993, we're still using the word alien, which that's my example of how slow the news is to evolve their language, because this was considered very offensive at this time. My next example is of who makes the decisions, or how do we decide what and who is covered in the newspaper. There's nothing wrong with this story that appeared in the paper in 1991. It's about a woman who was murdered, and the police are hunting for the slayer of her who killed her. But what we were talking about amongst some of my colleagues was why is this particular woman, is she making the news, and why aren't other people? As there's lots of women that are murdered, or people that go missing and they don't appear in the paper. Why this particular woman? So it comes down to who's deciding and who's making these choices. And this conversation has actually come up a lot recently when we're deciding what parts of town do we cover, what groups do we cover, and it's something we're really exploring as reporters and editors. This next example comes from 2004, and this is about who's invited to the conversation, who gets to make these choices. So when Roy Bragg was a reporter and a columnist at the San Antonio Express News in 2004, he wrote about a town called Nigden. And yes, that means exactly what you think it means. And there was lots of discussion about whether they were going to include the N-word in his story, and ultimately they decided to include it, but the article had a preface from the editor saying some of the terms relevant to this article can be offensive and reader discretion is advised. Then our columnist Carrie Clack in 2004, shortly after this article was written, wrote about the decision to use the N-word, and he thought it was the right decision. The paper made the right decision to use it because it just gave the story more of an impact. But what struck me about it, that in Carrie's column, he writes, "It should be noted that this management debate took place among whites. I hope the day is soon when there are African Americans in management at this paper, but I'm glad that there was genuine concern and sensitivity and a healthy debate about using the word." So this was back in 2004, and it's showing that we're evolved to opening the discussion, but I still think that there's a lot that the discussion can be opened, and we can learn from each other. So I'd like to, at this time, turn it back to Gilbert Garcia, who is going to lead us in a discussion. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Misty. And as Misty pointed out, we're going to leave the last 10 to 15 minutes of this event open for questions that you all might have. So if you do have any questions for our speakers, please enter them in the chat function on the Facebook Live event. I want to go forward with a question for each of the speakers, and wanted to get a sense from each of you. You could talk a little bit about what your family's relationship was with the news and coverage of the news when you were growing up. And in particular, I'm curious how they viewed the media's coverage of race. Carrie, I wanted to start with you, if we could.
Sure. Hello, everyone. Well, when I was growing up, we had three newspapers in the city. We had the San Antonio Express in the morning. In the afternoon, we had the San Antonio Evening News, and we had the San Antonio Light. And my family got all three newspapers up until, I mean, now where there's only one newspaper, but we always got all three newspapers. As I got older and began to read it myself and understand some of the conversations that were taken around me, there were conversations about not as much the language that was in newspapers, but the representation, or well, maybe in language in the sense, maybe sometimes if there was a crime committed, for instance, and you would know that there was a Black suspect because the paper or on TV, they would say the suspect was Black or Negro back then. Whereas if it was a white suspect, it was just a suspect. And then beyond that, there was just the whole question of when did the East Side, when did Black people get coverage? And for the most part, it seemed to be, you know, when either if you had to be an athlete or accused of a crime. And the final thing I would say is that growing up, there's nobody in my neighborhood, in my church, in my barbershop who knew anybody like us who wrote or photographed for any of the newspapers.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I grew up in the Rio Grande Valley, and we used to always joke that we only got on the national news when something terrible happened. You know, that was the only time we felt like we were kind of noticed by other parts of the country. Maddie, I want to get your sense about what your family's relationship was with the news growing up.
Yes, thank you. Growing up, I remember seeing the Express News newspaper on my paternal grandmother's coffee table every morning and every time I went over. But it was kind of one of those things, going off of what you and Carrie said, that there wasn't a lot of interest because none of the topics that we were involved in or the things that we were doing were being covered unless it was something like a shooting on our street or that sort of thing. There was no representation. No stories that really hit home for me growing up, nobody that I could look up to as a young journalist, really, and no real role models. So when I became a reporter, it was like everybody in the neighborhood wanted to give me their stories because it was a sense of, there's like a sense of disconnect and a mistrust of the media, I think, growing up or in my circles in my neighborhood. And so in doing that as a reporter, there's always that starting point that I want to earn my sources' trust before even getting to any of the interview or anything like that, because there is an underlying almost resentment of the past coverage and the underrepresentation of the communities in San Antonio.
Thank you. How about you, Misty? What was your family's relationship like?
I had a very different experience growing up with the newspaper, and I just remember my family being very trusting and reading the newspaper, and maybe not always agreeing with everything in there, but not really questioning. And I also like for my family, especially my mom, people on the news, like, television news were like celebrities.
Sure.
And when I told my mom that I was going into journalism, she's like, "Oh my God, you're going to be on TV." And I was like, no. I don't want to be a TV journalist. I want to write the news. And even now my mom will say, "Do you know so-and-so from KENS 5 or, KSAT or," so I think I had a very different experience growing up. And we got the newspaper every day, and I remember reading it faithfully every day growing up. And being in a military family too, and we moved around a lot. I
Mhm.
remember one of the best ways for me to get to know a town or place I was living in was the newspaper. That was one of my favorite aspects of moving to a new town, to check out the newspaper.
And so you had a real sense of trust and a sense that this is what connected you to the community.
Yeah, a sense of trust and connection, and always looking, kind of like looking up to reporters and thinking they were, they knew what was what.
Wanted to talk a little bit about how the media and its coverage of race affect major policies. We see this in areas of funding for education, healthcare, infrastructure. A lot of discussion in this community about what parts of the community get infrastructure projects and which ones don't, and in various social services. Maddie, I know this is something that you've been looking into. Can you talk a little bit about what you found?
Yes. So some background on my project with Columbia, I am researching the effects of redlining in San Antonio and racist policies like racial covenants as well. And a large chunk of my reading material came from Dr. Jose Cardenas's IDRA perspective that was published in 1997. And it's essentially his account of the education reform throughout the 60s that went into the 80s and 90s. And, it's still an ongoing issue. And so many times in this account, which is very lengthy, he mentions how the media became a barrier to getting support for, just something as simple, well, not as simple, but something that most would agree needs to happen, education equity. And he said that there were times when it wasn't the Express News, it was a TV journalist that he met with, that he, before the interview, went over, this is what's going on, this is what needs to happen. And the TV reporter, who he did not name, spit back the information to him, and it said, so you mean this would give Edgewood students the same funding as it would give Alamo Heights students? And he said, yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. And this reporter that he met said that he kind of just, scoffed at him and dismissed his story.
Mhm.
So, and then moving forward, as the years followed, because there was so much coverage on the walkouts and funding, all throughout the years. But he said that there were so many times that a reporter would call him up from even the newspapers and had no sense of what was going on. So half the interview, most of the interview would have to be him explaining the process and the issue at hand. And then when it came to print, he said that there were many times that the reporters got it all wrong and would kind of perpetuate these myths that the people who were against education and equity in education were spewing out, and reporters would kind of just regurgitate those in the papers. So it caused a lot of confusion, and he credits the media's mishandling of it to cause a lot of delay in any type of progress for equity in education. And kind of going back to the racial covenants, I was just digging into this last night, actually. Throughout the early 1900s, 1920s, there was a huge city builder named by the name of B.G. Irish. He came from St. Louis. And in the papers, he's celebrated as this great real estate investor who's doing, and he is credited for a lot of San Antonio neighborhoods. But if you go through any deed in Bexar County Clerk's office online, and you just search B.G. Irish deeds from that time period, almost every single deed has a racial restriction that explicitly rejects Mexicans and Black people from owning property or even living in those quarters in any of those neighborhoods. And when he died in 1930, it was just this glowing spread of this real estate developer, no mention of the racial covenants or the fact that all of these neighborhoods that he organized were racist. So I thought that was really interesting and very heartbreaking to just go through all of those files and see one after another, no Mexicans, no Blacks allowed. So
That's unbelievable. Either Carrie or Misty, do you have any thoughts on instances you can think of where just the media's coverage of race has affected, and it could be, it could be local or something a little broader, but how it's affected the way policy gets made, or it kind of shaped that the discussion when people who are in the position to make laws
Well, I
know,
think it
take on
all,
these issues.
oh, sorry.
go
I
ahead.
think it all comes down to when we're not holding people to account
Mhm.
and we're not covering certain areas, then we don't know that there's an issue. And if, we don't bring to light the issue as journalists, then the rest of the public doesn't know about it. For
Right.
instance, if there's medical disparity and it's not reported on, then the public doesn't know to, go to city council meetings, go to commissioners meetings, and to demand, that there be equal health care. So it all just comes down to these lost areas that aren't covered by the media.
And I'd say connecting with what Maddie and Misty are saying is the lack of coverage, the lack of understanding over decades over issues like the racial covenants when it comes to housing,
Mhm.
and connecting how the inability, the lack of African Americans and Mexican Americans to be able to get loans to buy their own house in certain neighborhoods perpetuated the racism and poverty. And when we talk about systemic racism, that's what we're talking about, how you can't look at how things are in 2022 and pretend that nothing happened in 1932 and 1942 or even before that connects to this. So if the media had, over the years, everyone, newspapers and broadcasts, had done a better job of explaining why conditions are the way they are now, and not just assuming that it's because those folks want to live like that, or those folks are missing something that within themselves that other folks don't have, we would have a better understanding of why so many of these racial inequities continue to exist.
Oh, yeah, that's a great point. Absolutely. As Maddie mentioned earlier, she was talking about the issue of creating trust with the people that you're covering, the people that you're interviewing. And so much of our work is really dependent on creating a sense of trust with the community. And that's really the kind of basis for everything that we do. And so I wanted to ask you all, how has the past news coverage from the Express News and other media outlets affected your reporting experiences when you've interacted with communities of color? And in particular, I'm wondering, do you find that some people that remember some of the headlines that Misty mentioned, or that kind of coverage, are they wary when it comes to talking with you? We'll start with Misty, and then we'll.
Okay, so I haven't done a whole lot of interaction with the public at the Express News, because I was kind of a behind the scenes person, and I just now came into a more of a public facing position as the op-ed and letters editor. But I can tell you from talking to people that have worked at the Express News that a lot of this does affect people's trust in the media. They're wary to talk to people because they've seen the way they've been portrayed, and they don't want to come off as looking bad in the media when that's not the whole story. The media sometimes tells a one-sided story. And even if, times have changed and evolved, it takes time to build that trust. I just think that it's just opening up that dialogue, talking to people, getting them to see that we want to change, we want to overcome our past, but it doesn't happen overnight. It takes time, because look at all the I mean, the Express News has been around since 1865, and I don't think we've really started challenging some of this past coverage until recently, and started trying to open up the dialogue. So you're trying to undo, lifetimes of bad news. And earlier you were asking, like Maddie and Carrie and myself about our family's relationship with the news. Well, you know, those relationships with the news get passed down generation to generation. If you hear your grandparents talking bad about the news or pointing out, you
Yep.
know, their
That's right.
racist tendencies, then I mean, you remember that. So it takes a lot of undoing. So we're just going to have to open up the dialogue and listen to people and try and do better.
Maddie, you talked a little bit already about the challenges you faced in trying to create, to trying to build trust with people because of their experiences with news coverage in the past. Could you talk a little bit more about, you know, some specific situations that you found yourself in?
So my situations are kind of unique in that, specific to my project, the people that I interviewed were part of the Edgewood walkouts, are still organizing today. And so they're very plugged into the news and they're very appreciative of the news coverage since the 1960s with the Edgewood walkout. Diane and Richard Herrera actually invited me to their home, and they have like a room full of just like clippings and news articles posted up. It's like a mini museum. And so they have everything, and their attitude towards that is much different than what I experienced covering stories that are current. Well, to back in that vein, I will also say too with that, I think that since the inequities are still ongoing and there's not always a lot of coverage on them, these people have, in the Edgewood circle, they've sometimes produced their own media outlets. I know Diane Herrera is on her own podcast that she has, because devoted specifically to education equities and the history surrounding it. But moving forward to current topics that I cover for kind of more the lifestyle, food and culture situation, because social media is such a monster and there are headlines coming at our audiences from every direction, there has been a lot of confusion in my reporting, or when I approach sources, they might think that I've already written something in the past that I had not, that was covered by another outlet in San Antonio that they didn't appreciate. So there's a lot of having to explain my readership and my writing to them to understand that wasn't me, that was just something that they saw on Facebook. I've encountered that a few times and kind of had to talk down some hostile conversations and identify my essay as being separate from any other outlet. But that just goes into the social media kind of wheel of headlines and posts and people not really being able to fact check whatever they see on Facebook and things like that. But that is more of an issue now than in trying to get people to talk with past issues.
Yeah, it gets complicated and it can be confusing, absolutely, for people out there. Harry, I wanted to get a sense of what you encountered when you first started writing for the Express News, and I know, and it's been a while, so your experiences might have changed a lot over the years. But what were the experiences? No, not really. But were people kind of distrustful or feeling like we have had bad experiences with this paper before?
It is a little different, and I think Maddie may have had the same experience. It's different when you're homegrown, and you know, when you're from the hood, people have known you since you were, you just learned to walk, and so they already feel this kind of connection. So when you're talking about interviewing sources within communities which traditionally have not been given the respect, the time that they should have been given, well, there's already this kind of inherent level of trust that you have. And then over the years, as they see your work, that bond is stronger. But yeah, there is as Misty and Maddie have said, there is a lot of still residual anger and distrust from, and again, not just our newspaper, from any media outlet for coverage over the years. And so you still find that some people never forget and maybe a little bit more understanding and willing to talk, or willing to hear, to think that the newspaper is going to be faithful to what they tell them, but there's still a little bit of distrust.
Sure. We've talked about past failures. I want to talk a little bit about how you all feel like we'd want to cover these stories today. And I also wanted to to discuss the issue of where the newspaper puts its emphasis. Because when we talk about media choices, we're not only talking about choices that are made in how a story is edited and how a story is presented, but what stories make it into the paper and what stories don't make it into the paper, and how much attention is given to one story versus another. And I think we probably all had experiences where people will say to us, even if we might not be in a position where we had control over that, they'll say, you know, why are you all covering this so much, and why aren't you talking more about this other thing, which is really important? And it's something that I think is always a concern for people in the community. And you know, one story that comes to mind, and this is Misty presented the headline for this story earlier, and I was the young reporter at the San Antonio Light when this story happened. I was covering night police beat, and this was the story of a young mother who was walking her baby in Olmos Park in 1991, and she was murdered. It was a terrible tragedy, and understandably, it got a tremendous amount of coverage over a pretty long period of time in both local print and broadcast media. But even at the time, I remember some of the discussion among reporters, and this was in no way an attempt to belittle the tragedy or the importance of the story, but it just discussion within the newspaper and among various people in the local media about the fact that these, you know, there were murders happening in other parts of the city that we're not getting comparable coverage, and that if we saw a person of color killed on the south side or the west side or the east side, it might be thinking in print terms, it might have been like a small below the fold story that would be quickly forgotten, while this story really consumed the local media for quite a while. So I want to get a sense from you how you know, we're not always in the position where we ourselves maybe have control over what stories get, you know, make it in the paper or which ones don't, but get your thoughts on how we would cover things now as compared to the past, and where you think the emphasis should be in terms of what we're giving our coverage to. And I'll start with you, Maddie.
Oh, no pressure.
Sorry about that.
So when I started at my essay, I think this goes into like why representation is important. As Carrie said, going off of what Carrie said earlier, it's different when you're coming from the community. People know who you are. You're from the hood, which I am. And I brought this voice to my essay that was much different than had been done before. It was kind of this like rural San Antonio culture. And I was very proud to bring that level of content to our readers that are from the areas south of 90, you know, that are from the downtown area, South Central, West Side, South Side. It gave them something to be excited to read about. These were stories, you know, human interest stories, profile stories, people in the community that were doing really great things. And so that was a little, a part, not a little part of it, it's a huge part of the city, a huge demographic that wasn't getting a light shined on them before. And now it kind of sets that bar as, you know, if I do something cool, you know, maybe somebody will write about it, or let's tell a paper about it, let's tell my essay about it, let's tell the news about it, because now there's that outlet to share those stories. As far as the murders, my essay doesn't cover murders or breaking news like crime anymore. So I don't know how we would handle that. I know that a lot of conversations nationally kind of looked at the case, the Gabby Petito case, and all of the other missing people's cases that were, you know, her case, and the discussion surrounding that started leading to all these other missing people that had been gone for weeks. And now there was more discussion and more discovery into those cases. But I think as a whole, as a nation, we're dissecting these headlines and wondering, you know, why this kind of reading between the lines and trying to figure out, well, why did that story get covered and this one didn't? And it's important to realize that and kind of see that in our decision making and in the fairness of it all.
Carrie, what are your thoughts on that? On just where we put the emphasis when we cover things and how we find the right balance?
Well, actually, I mean, just going directly from what Maddie just said about the Gabby Petito case, because what the story that stays with me is it was about the early to mid 2000s. It's around the same time. I think it was right at the same time that Elizabeth Smart was kidnapped.
Mhm.
There was a 12 or 13-year-old Mexican-American girl on the south side of San Antonio who went missing. I think we did, I don't know if we did more than one story on it. I'm almost certain we didn't, because it was just something that when I first saw the story, it stayed in my mind. I know that KSAT did a couple of stories.
Mhm.
And, but police were saying, well, assuming she ran away, there was just total lack of attention. And I think she was missing for 6 weeks. And after that time, she was finally found in the home of a guy not too far from where she lived on the south side off of Mission Road. She was still alive. I mean, she was alive, but you know what she'd been through.
Mhm.
And that it just stays in my mind as an example of not giving the kind of coverage that we probably would have given to her if she was a white girl. Everyone, white girl, white, black, Mexican American, Asian, male, female, and if they're missing in that situation, they should be given the kind of coverage that it merits. But if we, and I say we, are the media, had been responsible at that time, whatever she went through, it may not have had to have been for 6 weeks. I do now. Obviously, I think that because of where we are now, with the whole, missing white woman syndrome, it makes us more conscious of women of other communities who are missing. I'm fairly certain that wouldn't happen now. I'm fairly certain. So that's progress.
Yeah, that is. What are your thoughts on that, Misty?
I was just going to say that I think a lot of it comes down to who we have in the newsroom, because when we have someone like Maddie, she mentioned that she can bring these new story ideas and have this great impact on covering communities that maybe we've neglected in the past. So it helps to have homegrown journalists, I think, in the newsroom, because I think it has more of a sense of urgency when someone that's grown up and knows the issues brings it to an editor and says, hey, this story is really important, versus someone that's new, doesn't really know San Antonio, and maybe it can get brushed aside and the editor's like, no, you don't know what you're talking about. Whereas like someone that's from here, they can fight for it a little bit more and get the coverage out there. So I think it's really important to have some homegrown journalists in the newsroom. And I think we're improving on that, bringing new people in, new voices in. And I think that's where the future is, and that's where we need to really concentrate if we want to be better at covering our community.
I'm wondering if you all can think of any examples in which you disagreed with editors over the coverage of race and how you handled it. I'll start with you, Carrie. In a personal way, I remember that in 2009, Reverend Claude Black, who many of you may remember, prominent leader in San Antonio, he was in the hospital. I grew up across the street from Reverend Black. He was like a surrogate grandfather, and he went into the hospital. This was January of 2009, early on, and I went to go see him, and he was semi-comatose. And he was at the Knicks downtown, and his hospital room looked out towards the east side. So knowing about his life, I wrote this reflective column about his 90 years. A person I'll just call the editor. The editor let it be known that he didn't like the column because I hadn't talked to Reverend Black. I hadn't talked to Reverend Black because he was semi-comatose. And the editor said, well, he had visited him and he was sitting on his bed and laughing and talking with him. Well, this was sometime earlier. So one of and this is the only time that this ever happened to me as a columnist. I don't know if this ever happened to you, Gilbert, where
where someone told you basically as punishment that this is what you have to cover. My punishment from the editor was to cover the next week's MLK March. You know, if I don't believe that the editor was or is racist, but he didn't have me go cover the Cesar Chavez March will be coming up in a couple of months, or the Women's Day March. And I don't know if I was right if he would have had me go cover the MLK March. But the fact that apart from everything else on his judgment on other things, the fact that he considered that punishment to make me as a columnist go cover the MLK March, I thought was revealing. That aside, I have to say that in my experience at the paper, the first time I was there and the second time around, I have found editors and other reporters wanting to do the right thing, wanting to provide the right coverage. Now again, that goes with the representation that you have in management, which is still very lacking, and there's no African Americans in management at the Express News. And as far as I know, there's never been any. So that's going to always reveal a blind side. But I've always found the editors, folks in power in the newsroom to at least want to try to do the right thing, to want to try to provide the right coverage. And sometimes they'll ask you questions that you think you should know this yourself. But you have to understand they're trying to learn, they're trying to understand. If someone's trying to do that, then you have to cooperate. But I can honestly say that I've never had anyone say, an editor say that say or do something in a way that I would consider racist when it came to coverage. It's definitely something that was done in an intentional way.
Great. Maddie, or have you had instances where you've disagreed with editors on the coverage of race? And I'm also curious what kind of newsroom conversations, and a lot of us have spent a pretty good amount of time over the past 2 years with the pandemic, working outside the office. But what has your experience been when it comes to interacting with editors on that issue, and what kind of discussions happen?
Yeah, I'm actually on the flip side since I came in 2015. So I think I came in luckily during the part of the Express News and my ISA being a lot more responsible and conscious about the story writing and how things are handled. So I've actually found a lot of agreement and guidance, and especially as a really green reporter in 2016, I think one of the first stories that I wrote dealing with racism and segregation was about a racial covenant that was found for a home on the Northeast side. And it was a Latina woman and her fiance who was Black, and so both, have this racial covenant been still active and not illegal, neither would be able to own this home. They found it in the buying process. And I remember my editor at the time and I, realized the history behind it. And it wasn't just an interview with the couple, it was actually talking to the county clerk at the time and explaining how these records are handled when they come across. Obviously, there's a law now that kind of gives people the opportunity to remove that language if they see fit. But we went into all of that and we discussed how important it was for our readers to know that these things still exist and they can be found in your deeds if you go looking through them. And more recently, there was a story that came across my inbox from the New York Times. This was for Black History Month, so pretty recent. And the New York Times did this kind of travel forward piece about San Antonio being a destination for Black History Month. And yeah, it's all great. That would be great if that was the case, if everybody agreed that, but it wasn't. As a Latina woman, that's not my lived experience to cover or to even, talk about the merit of that being true. So I spoke with my editor, Jess, here at my ISA, and I said, I don't feel comfortable just regurgitating whatever the New York Times says. If it was something about, about the Mexican community or anything like that, I could, but I don't feel comfortable. So I asked for more time and she agreed, and I was able to get a couple of leaders from the Black community to say, do you feel this is true? And the response was interesting. They said that, as proud as they are of the progress, you can't deny that San Antonio has had this history of dismissing Black History Month and the progress or the contributions the Black community has had in San Antonio as a whole. So, and I'm glad we have that input in there because that's something that I would have not been able to say myself. So I have had a lot of support and guidance. Obviously, the Black Lives Matter events that happened in May 2020, I couldn't just sit behind my computer and watch this happen from my home office, obviously work from home. And all I had to say was, hey, I want to go out there. I want to report. I want to get some profiles. I want to talk to these people. And both Express News and MISA were very supportive of me being out there, spending all day out there as a team with my fellow reporters. So I was very appreciative of that as well.
Misty, what are your thoughts about the kind of conversations that are happening in the newsroom about the issue of race?
I think actually we've improved a lot. That we're having more open conversations, that people aren't shying away from topics that make them feel uncomfortable. I feel like, when reporters have issues that they want to push back on, I see more reporters sticking up for themselves. I also think it's a product of, we started a committee here at the San Antonio Express News, the Diversity and Inclusion Committee, which has people from, not just the newsroom, but all over the company, marketing and finance, advocating for people and opening up the discussion so that people are more open and willing to go to editors and say, hey, look, I don't think we're covering this issue properly, or hey, I don't like that we left out a certain part of town. And I think at least, editors may not always agree with us, or may not always include our inputs, and we don't always have the outcome that we'd like, but at least, I think I see more people willing to stick up for themselves, willing to come forward and start these conversations with their editors, where in the past I know people have felt kind of a little uncomfortable, a little afraid, and they weren't even willing to talk to their editors. So I think that's a really good positive thing, and hopefully it'll only improve with time. I mean, it does take time, and it does take, education to know, what to be pushing back against.
And Gilbert, let me say two quick things.
Sure.
It's important to note that the Diversity and Inclusion Committee, which Misty talked about, it actually formed like a couple of months before George Floyd was killed. It wasn't a response to George Floyd, but relating to Floyd and the coverage after. And I didn't participate in any of the coverage. I got sick around that same time, and so I never went out on the streets. But I don't know if I've ever been as proud of this newspaper as the way we covered as young reporters, like, and some not so young reporters, but reporters like Maddie and just the whole team, the way they were out there every day, every night, covering this. And I don't know if it's something that would have happened 25, 30 years ago, and no one was expecting this to happen, but that it happened in real time, and this newspaper and the reporters and photographers responded. As I said, it's one of the most proudest times I've felt towards this newspaper. And there's been many times that I felt proud about this newspaper, but this particular time in the wake of George Floyd's murder stands out for me.
Yeah, I felt exactly the same way. Absolutely. Well, we're gonna go to a question that we received, and we had someone asking for your recommendations for reading materials to help understand the local history of San Antonio. And Harry, I'll start with you and see if you anything comes to mind that you think could be helpful to someone who's trying to kind of get a sense of what just to understand our history better.
Let me say first, I think this is something that we ought to, after this is over and later on, we ought to actually come up with some kind of bibliography, because it's a great question.
Maybe we
And
can put it on social media. That'd be great. Yeah.
yeah, it's a great question because there's a lot of great stuff I'm not going to think about right now. John Philip Santos, Places Left Unfinished at the Time of Creation.
Mhm.
Cold Anger by Mary Beth Rogers, which is about the history of cops, but it's also a nice history of San Antonio and the inequities in San Antonio that gave rise for cops to form. Enchanted City by Frank Jennings, and there's a novel by Severo Perez called Odd Birds, and it's set in the 1960s in San Antonio, and it's set around the civil rights movement and the desegregation of the counters, the sit-ins at Woolworth and Crest. Those are just 3 or 4 that come to mind, and like y'all later on, I'll come up with a lot more.
Yeah, yeah, I think we all will. Well, thank you. What about you, Maddie? Anything that you think of off the top of your head?
I think circling back to Dr. Jose Cardenas, if you really want to get into the nitty gritty of education, finance, and all the behind the scenes things that were going on, it's free. It's available online for free. You can download it as a PDF. It's 1997, but it's still, a lot of the stuff that's in there is still pretty current. And then all of the deeds that I was talking about, those are all available in the county clerk's office. The homeowners loan corporation, the redlining maps, the survey reports, which are very eye-opening, those are all available through the UTSA Special Collections Department. You can download those as well, read through them. A lot of it is like very old type font, but you can get like the transcription of that on the bottom, which is very easy to read and very painful to read on some parts. And I will plug my upcoming project that's going to be published soon that kind of ties that all in together in one place to read it. So that should be publishing this week, if not today.
And we have a question. It's for you, Maddie, that I think will apply to what you've been talking about. I'm just going to read the question. It says, what are some of those neighborhoods that he developed?
Good question. So a big one is Beacon Hill, and then areas around Manchkey Park, Alamo Heights area. I think one of them was also like Highlands, Harlandale. I saw a map somewhere in our old clippings where it was just this huge San Antonio sprawl, and it was just, I'm seeing that they had like little, I think one of them was actually Collins Garden, but it wasn't as affluent, but it was also racially restricted, which is very close to where I live. And so quite a few, but the big ones that stick out are Beacon Hill and areas around Manchkey Park. There was a neighborhood back in the day called Queensboro Place, I'm sorry, and that was in the Alamo Heights area. So those are some of the notable ones.
Misty, do you have any recommendations on reading materials that could be helpful to people?
Yeah, so your library is your best friend. Specifically, if you're interested in history, I would visit the Texana room at the Central Library, which is downtown, the big red enchilada.
Right.
They're a wealth of information, books, photographs. You can even access through MySapple. I'm not sure if you have to be on one of their computers or if you can do it through their website, which is mysapple.org. It's my San Antonio Public Library. You can access a resource called Newsbank, which will give you access to old newspapers in San Antonio. So you can read old San Antonio Light and old Express newspapers. So yeah, also UTSA Special Collections, Maddie mentioned them. they also have a wealth of information. You can also, from their website, the UTSA Special Collections website, you can access old photos of San Antonio that kind of tell the story too, old articles too, and old like dissertations and things of that nature
Great.
that are really helpful and interesting. So yeah, the library is your best friend.
Those Newsbank is the greatest resource. I've spent so many nights up to like 3 a.m. looking through stuff. This goes beyond our timeline, but one of the craziest comparisons that I read was the 1921 flood.
Mhm.
You know, the days leading up to it, there was so much coverage surrounding the heir of Joski's dying in one of the surrounding rivers in a flood, or not a flood, I'm sorry, a drowning. And the coverage of Society News, so-and-so had posted so-and-so for tea, and so-and-so was vacationing in New York City and is visiting Colorado. And they knew that a huge flood was coming,
Mhm.
a huge storm was coming that would be the end to the drought and was going to save local agriculture. There were no warnings, you know, for anybody who lived in these areas that they knew would flood. You know, I don't know what they could do for them, but there was no warning. You know, everything was Society News, Joski's son. And then 2 days later, you know, the Mexican refugees. And if you look at the names of the people who died, all Latino surnames,
Mhm.
all on the side. And it's just like, and a few days later, San Antonio was claimed to be this city, you know, that was coming out triumphant, that we were going to make it out of the flood. And meanwhile, there was a tent city set up on the west side because so many of the Latinos had lost their homes. But San Antonio was going to be triumphant. So, and it was more of, look at all of this property damage downtown, not look at all these lives lost on the west side and on the south side. So I think
I'm glad Maddie mentioned that, because the 1921 flood, that's an important marker in this city's history when it comes to inequity. And Troy Miller just published a book last year
Right.
on the flood, and it talks about, well, like what Manny says, you had just most of the fatalities came from the west side, and the aftermath of this flood was to build the Almas Basin, which protected certain neighborhoods, but did nothing for the west side, and that leads back to the development of COPS and the whole drainage issue. So yeah, there's an endless reams of material to learn about San Antonio. We just have to think of them.
And that's one of that story is, I mean, one of the most dramatic examples is something we talked about, which is how media coverage affects policy. Media coverage, the media dropped the ball when it came to how they treated this story and the impact of the story, and policy failed, you know, at least in some respects because of that coverage. Well, I think we've run. We should do. I think, yeah. Just wanted to check to see if we had any other questions. I think that's going to be it, and we really appreciate all of you for joining this history and headlines discussion. And please, if you're watching, please join me in thanking our speakers, Carrie Clack, Madeline Mendoza, Misty Harris, who were all fantastic. And we think this is a really productive way for us to kind of assess what we do, what we've done in the past, and how we go forward. And we're really glad that you were part of it with us. So thank you.